Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate, and this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get people talking. The Empusium is the latest novel from Nobel Prize winner Olga Tokarczuk. Set in a sanatorium on the eve of World War I, it offers a haunting portrayal of health, death, and all that comes in between. The book has received rave critical reviews, with fellow author Harry Kunzru calling it elegant and genuinely unsettling in the New York Times, while the FT's reviewer called it a novel that in Tokarczuk's dexterous hands transcends its own limits, further cementing the Nobel laureate as one of the most original storytellers of our age. Equipped with only our measly 5 senses, it leaves us questioning, just like her characters, what might be hiding in plain sight. The critics may have been impressed, but what did Laura's book club think of it? Book clubber Phil Chafee joins us from New York to report back. I've got friend of the show, Sarah Oliver, not in the book club, but book club adjacent, also joining us here in London, and I've been reading along as well. If we're lucky, Laura might coalesce out of some wood smoke and moss and join us at the end. We'll be bringing you our thoughts on the book, our recent reads, and some recommendations. All that coming up here on the Book Club Review. Firstly, welcome, Phil. Thanks for joining us. Are you well?
I am great. How are you?
I'm okay. Sarah, I know from WhatsApp that you're not feeling 100%. Do we need to pack you off to an alpine health resort?
Not this one. Thank you. Although I would only be there as a worker, wouldn't I?
Well, it's a great shame not to have you both here in person, as I have got a big green bottle of Schwarmerei I was planning to share with you. This is the homemade liqueur that they all get addicted to in the novel. But before we get to this book, tell me what you've been reading recently. Phil, shall we start with you?
One that I actually just finished yesterday, which was completely delightful, was this book called The Sewing Girl's Tale, which is set in, I guess, very, very early American history. It's set in 1793, and it opens with this sewing girl in downtown Manhattan. I mean, there was all that inhabited Manhattan at that time, who effectively had gone out the previous night with this much more wealthy, posh man who then pushed her into a brothel at the end of the night and raped her. It doesn't go into the graphics of that, but it then follows her odyssey to pursue justice in 1793 New York. And you learn so much about the society and the legal system and the patriarchal rules. It was an amazing read and a page turner, but also, I mean, basically, there's bits of dialogue there, but it seems like that is all taken from court records and other things. I highly recommend it. It was very evocative, very thought-provoking, and it was a slice of history that I was pretty unfamiliar with.
I've just looked it up. That's by John Wood Sweet. It's non-fiction, is it?
Basically, yeah.
Narrative non-fiction.
Exactly.
That's a delightful genre. Always love that. And Sarah, how about you?
I just finished Two-Step Devil by Jamie Quattro. I don't know if it's out in England yet. I got it in America. I loved it. It's a really nice novel about a sort of right-wing hermit in the tri-state, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee area who sees a young woman who he thinks to be in trouble and rescues/kidnaps her and takes her on as maybe part of fulfilling his religious prophecy. And it's awesome. It changes genre, it changes layout. It's written in this narrative with him first, where it's flashbacks and forwards, and then his visions that he has, religious visions. And then when it switches to her, it's this timeline agenda that she has, and then it goes into a play at one point. It's wonderful. I really enjoyed it.
That sounds great. I've never heard of either of those books, so thank you very much. I confess I have been on quite a long run of very mood-driven reading. I've just finished a romantic comedy called The Flatshare book I'd never heard of until it was recommended to me recently. I feel like most people are going, oh my God, I can't believe Kate's never read The Flatshare. Such a fun read, a brilliant romantic comedy. The setup is that the main character, Tiffy, she's broken up with her boyfriend. She needs to leave his apartment. London prices being what they are, her options are appalling. She looks at these terrible places and realizes it's just all going to be awful. And then she spies this advert for what looks like quite a nice flat. But the catch is she will only get it. It's like a timeshare arrangement. The person who lives there works nights in a hospital. Yeah. Leon, so he's got the flat during the day, and Tiffy has it from something like 6 p.m. till 8 the following morning. And so there's this really delightful setup where they're living together and they're sharing a bed, but they never actually meet. And that's this fun premise. But I just really love the way that she developed it so cleverly. It does really keep you engaged. The characters felt like real people. It was surprisingly funny and sharp and so happily kept me turning the pages. And I suppose I'm only speaking about this with a slight edge to my voice because I just recently read an Emily Henry novel, Book Lovers, on Laura's recommendation. And I was so dismayed by the degree to which that book didn't really satisfy me or deliver what I really wanted, which is a really fun escape. And I was so happy that this book by Beth O'Leary was exactly what I wanted. She is so great. So if you're feeling in the mood for a really solid romance, then I can't recommend this highly enough. I loved it. And just to get my literary credentials back up onto the high ground, I got through the post. This is the first volume of my Fizcarraldo poetry subscription. So in a fit of self-improvement, I signed up for this subscription. I mean, I do love all things Fizcarraldo, but at the same time, you know, this is me, right? This is like aspirational territory. But I did want this year to be the year that I tried to read more poetry. And I did think that a beautiful Fizcarraldo book coming in the post might be the thing to get me to do it. And so this is the first one. I think you get 3 or 4 a year. It's called Strange Beach. It's by Oluwaseum Olayiwola. And I was excited, but at the same time I read the back and it says Olaiwola's intimate and elemental debut reveals a queer consciousness deeply steeped in poetic traditions of nuanced confession and moving abstraction. Burning with complicated desires, shifting atmospheric conditions and gymnastical syntax, the resulting work transmutes messages to the mind of the reader with a feeling of cosmic intuitiveness as emotion and intellect grapple and forge. And I really thought, good Lord, this is way over my head. But I thought, I've got this book. So I sat down on the sofa and I started to read it. And do you know what? I read the whole thing. I loved how it made me feel when I was reading it. And I can't claim to have understood all of it, but it actually really meant something to me and it really moved me. And I really loved the experience of reading it. I basically read it because I didn't want to stop. So that was actually
that sounds wonderful.
A really surprising hit. He had this line about the sea, about the waves on the beach. He called them little interruptions in the way of things. And I just loved that. I thought that's so great. Anyway, from that, let us come to the Empusium, which I've attempted to summarize, which I think we can all agree is not easy. Here's my go at it. First of all, the names. So this is a book full of a lot of names that it's not obvious how to pronounce them. And one of the things I thought was very kind of Olga Tokarczuk is that quite early in the novel, she does actually include a line that tells us how to pronounce the name of our hero, spelled Wojnicz. She says, Voynich slowly and clearly pronounced his own first name and surname in the hope that the other would remember them. Mieczysław Voynich. So there we go. Young sanitation engineer Voynich has been unwell and he is sent to a mountain resort to recover. He's not staying at the official sanatorium, but he's staying at a guest house further down the valley, where people who are slightly less ill seem to be staying. He is to stay for a long time, and he's following a strict regime of treatments, and he gradually gets to know the other men who are staying at this guest house. With not much else to do, the men gather for meals and to philosophize, although it is notable that their most frequent recurring subject is the inferiority of women. The wife of the guest house owner, Opitz, dies mysteriously the day after Voynich arrives. More generally, there aren't many women around, and when we do see them, they're quite distant figures. Voynich does make a friend, a young man passionate about art, who is unfortunately rather more seriously ill. And the only other thing I noted is that after a while, the reader might realise that the novel is being narrated by someone else. But who is that someone? And what do they want? So Actually, let's start with the very basics. Why did your book club come to choose this one, Phil? Do you remember? I know it's been a while ago since you read it.
I think we had never, as a book club, discussed Olga Tokarczuk before. I think she is someone all of us had read something of, or at least all of us had intended to read some of. And this was one of the hot new books of last year. She is one of the hipper of the Nobel laureates, I would say. And yeah, and it was also, I think, the topic matter. I think who does not love a good sanatorium fic? I think that was the origin story.
It does have this sanatorium setting. And I suppose one of the interesting things about it is that the way it's marketed, one of the connections that the publishers made in how they're pitching the book is this take on The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, which just so happens we read for the podcast. You were involved in that show, weren't you, Phil? Did you read it?
I was, yeah. I read it with
then?
you. Yeah.
So that's great, isn't it? Because not everyone's read The Magic Mountain, but it so happens that we have. And it's true that it feels like perhaps Mann was the original person to set up this scenario of this young man, this coming-of-age story. He's stuck in this health resort in the mountains, not much is happening, and therefore all the focus can be on philosophical ideas, and it's this enclosed space where he sets all these different opposing ideas in motion as voiced by all these different characters, as at the same time people sicken and they die, and so it's this opportunity to muse on the nature of life and death and time, and all of that is drawn together really cleverly by Thomas Mann in that very long novel. I actually was surprised in a way at how indirect I thought the relationship was between the two books. I felt like she took on board the tropes and the settings. But apart from that, I actually wasn't seeing a lot of echoes with that big, thick novel. And I certainly don't think you need to have read Thomas Mann to really enjoy and appreciate the Empusium.
I would say it helps to have read Thomas Mann. I think in interviews, she has said she has read The Magic Mountain multiple times. She certainly had that in her head while she's reading this. In terms of the direct plot similarities, this is in Poland. Magic Mountain is set in Switzerland. You do have this outsider, the Magic Mountain's Hans Kastorp, who comes down from Hamburg, right? But this one is actually not really set in the sanatorium. It's set in the guest house outside of the sanatorium. We barely make it into the sanatorium at all. It's set in the guest house in the woods outside the guest house, I should say. The other crucial parallel you sketch, Kate, is the time period, because they are both set just before World War One, and both of them, I think that is very important thematically, that you have this sense of this age ending and the young character at the end. We vaguely know what happens to both of them in both books as World War One hits. And I think that is a key thematic overlap.
Well, what do you think then? Because I suppose the other reason I felt that there's a bit of a disconnect is, for all The Magic Mountain is quite a somber book, it's also a book where we joked, didn't we, about how much we would love to spend time in Hans Kastorp's sanatorium, right? It's this really comfortable place. The food is delicious. They really look after you. You have enforced rest time where all you have to do is just sit around and read. And generally, although it's very sad because the people who are there are really there for sad reasons, it didn't seem bad at all. Whereas this particular village in the mountains and this particular guest house were not really something that you'd want to spend time with. What did you think, Sarah, about this quite claustrophobic atmosphere of this village and this guest house?
Well, first to say, I didn't read Magic Mountain. I do think it has the same setup, though. I didn't realize that, but it's absolutely people in a closed space discussing philosophy, becoming those characters, who they discuss, and hinting at where things will go through their philosophy. It's not glamorous, right? I mean, he talks that our protagonist talks a lot about money and about being an other before we know, I don't know how far we're going to get into spoilers and stuff, but financially he's an other and he's worried about making ends meet. And you kind of get the sense that even though the others, some of them are more reluctant to reveal that they also don't have as much money, but these people, they're not as well off. They can't do the big fancy place. They can't afford it.
And talking about a health resort horror story, you're prepared from the title for these dark, creepy elements to come. And sure enough, they do come quite quickly from the disconcerting death of the guest house owner's wife. And she is then laid out on the dining table. That's where Voynich first sees her. So it opens with this quite haunting scene. And then there are strange noises in the attic. He sees mist going out into the woods. There are odd mounds that seem to be drawing him towards them. Everyone is slightly fey, all the villagers, and no one's quite clear about what really is going on as you start to appreciate that actually something is going on in the background. What did you think about this atmosphere of creeping dread?
I didn't think it was dreadful enough. I thought it was dark, macabre, or whatever, but it's not scary. I read this because I loved Flights and all the philosophy in that, and I loved Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead, which was such a good mystery novel. So I kind of had that expectation going in. I like that she goes for it, and she goes for it in this, but it doesn't work as well as a horror novel as Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead works as a mystery novel. And I was a little let down by that.
Yeah, I felt the same. How about you, Phil?
I would actually say that title is a bit of misdirection. I think, yes, it is not particularly scary in terms of the death at the beginning and the noises in the night, but at my book group, few people enjoyed it, partially because of these long sections of these old men spouting at each other late at night, just saying the most insanely misogynistic things, going on for a while. And I think that is the horror story. I think the horror story is this deep misogyny.
Yeah.
And I think this is very intentional on Tokarczuk's part. There's a couple big plot spoilers at the end, but the biggest spoiler is actually in the afterword, where Tokarczuk reveals, and you can decide if we want to reveal this later, but she reveals something that then makes sense of these excruciating passages to read.
Oh, I loved that. Made me love it.
I loved that reveal.
I loved that too. I read that and was like, yes.
If we were in real life book club, I would be like, okay, this is book club. Everyone's read it. And anyone who hasn't, fair game. Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it, though? Because it is nice.
Ooh, can you do it as
it's a nice bit when you get there.
As an addendum, like in the podcast?
Yeah.
You click this button if you want to feel
at the very end of this show. If you keep listening past the closing music, you would be in a slightly odd position of someone who basically knows they're not going to read the book and find out for themselves, but they really want to know what that afterward.
Or if you have read the book, just keep waiting past the credits.
Yeah.
And we can discuss what we all...
Does that mean we can talk about it now then?
Yes.
And I'll just
and then you'll edit it over, yeah.
Well, in that case, I'm going to read it. And also, of course, the other thing is, where are the women? The omission of the women in this book. And this absence of women. And then the general way that they're viewed. I mean, I'm sure, Sarah, you've got some choice lines. I've got a few bits that I underlined as I was going through it. There's a bit where the doctor at the sanatorium, he's actually, relatively speaking, Sempervice, his name is. Of all of them, he's a relatively sympathetic character. But they're talking about Voynich's mother having died when he was just a baby. She basically died giving birth to him. And he says, "Oh, well, it's a pity she died," said the doctor, "but that doesn't mean she's blameless. She left you when you needed her most." It's just like, this poor woman, it's her fault. Then you would have to fortify your virility, stand up to this softening energy. That's what you need, Voynich. You must kill in yourself your mother who abandoned you. She died. I didn't have to kill her, Voynich corrected him. Even so, she abandoned you, and that is taking strength away from you. To make up for her absence, you identify with her in a dangerous way, hence this ladylike effeminacy, this softness that he sees in Voynich, which is actually another thread that starts to come to the fore with this main character and this coming-of-age story for him. I actually listened to the audiobook of this. I read it and I listened to it at the same time. It's very well read by Natasha Sudek. I think the humour really comes out when you listen to it. I noticed the lines about women a lot more in the telling of it than I did on the page where I was just sliding over the paragraphs. So I recommend that. That's very fun.
I have one while they're all talking at dinner one night. Woman represents a bygone inferior stage of evolution, so writes Darwin, and he of all people has something to say on the matter. Woman is like, and here he thought the right word, an evolutionary laggard. While man has gone on ahead and acquired new capabilities, woman has stayed in her old place and does not develop. That is why a woman is often socially handicapped, incapable of coping on her own, and must always be reliant on a man. She has to make an impression on him by manipulation, by smiling. Mona Lisa's smile symbolizes a woman's entire evolutionary strategy for coping with life, which is to seduce and manipulate.
And I couldn't find it. I listened to it, and then when I flipped back through the book, I wanted to find the point in the text, and I couldn't. But there's some point where they're discussing women being dry and their wombs wandering around their body. And it's only intercourse with men that causes the womb to then settle and stay in the right place, which again, when I listen to it, kind of like, sort of slightly spit out your T line, but all the more astonishing when you then read that afterword. That's why that afterword has such power, I think. I got a little bit about literary criticism I pulled out. I read some literary criticism in the local papers that was written by a woman, said Lucas, continuing the discussion interrupted by the herrings. So here, too, the suffragists want to have their say. It is truly grotesque. As far as brilliance in literature is concerned, dear gentlemen, said August, picking up the topic, the surest sign of an outstanding work is that women do not like it. The higher you value someone, the lower women will rate him, and that's because what women seek in literature is an excuse to arouse their emotions. They are a long way from making use of ideas. And so it goes on.
These can be funny at times, but I think you laugh a bit and then that just keeps on going.
Yeah.
And going, and it can get very tedious, these long sections. I mean, that makes it all the more powerful when you get the explanation at the end. But
well, having said, I felt like there was some token parallels with the Magic Mountain, but I almost wasn't seeing as much of a correspondence between the two as I wanted to, because I was just so interested in that. But one thing that is spot on is that the Magic Mountain is a very boring book. It's just long. It's very long. And I say that because I think Mann meant it to be. I think actually it's important to the structure of that book that you get a bit, what's the word? Institutionalized by this droning, it goes on and you're stuck in this place and you're trapped with these people and you're trapped in time. And then at the end, when the pace really changes, it all makes sense why he chose to do it that way and why it was so important to him that it was as long as it was and that you did get as bored as you did.
This is a little bit different because I'm sympathizing with the main character, with the protagonist who isn't quite man and is reckoning with that. And he's feeling trapped by his condition, trapped by his finances, and now philosophically trapped, and everything's closing in. So as you read it, you're not just observing poker night or whatever. Something's in the room that's not quite right, and it's not going to, I don't know.
Yes, that's what I thought was another thing that was so clever, was the way that this is a relatively short, what is my edition? 300 pages. It's actually quite concise. And yet she's somehow managed to capture that sense of that being trapped in these endless philosophical conversations with these men. And then, yes, as you say, it brilliantly manages to capture that sense of these longueurs, but at the same time, it's actually quite pacey. There's usually something going on, one thing after another, in a way that did draw me through it. Actually, would I say that? Was I drawn through it? I would have liked to have been drawn through it more than I was. Maybe that's why I was relating it to the man, because I remember I really struggled, and in the end it was only going to Switzerland and reading it there, just coincidentally. I didn't plan a trip in order to read the Magic Mountain, but we happened to be going and I took it with me, and that really helped. But I wonder if I would have got through it otherwise. I do remember having at one point to really dig deep, and I think with this it did, not so much listening to it, but certainly reading it on the page, I wasn't rushing for excuses to pick it up, and yet when I did, I enjoyed it.
I just said how there were bits that do slog because of that droning on with this misogynist stuff, but there's nothing like the hundreds of pages of Settembrini and NAFTA going on in the Magic Mountain.
Yeah.
And that is truly a slog. This is not comparable. And I do think because this also has this other surface horror story stuff going on, and you're curious what's going on with that, you then become very curious the nature of this protagonist. There's a very sweet little romance with the protagonist and another lodger.
Yeah.
Yeah, I very much enjoyed this. And I think it's certainly a much easier read than The Magic Mountain.
I was interested when I looked on the Fizcarraldo, it's published in the UK by Fizcarraldo, they're known for their very beautiful blue but very minimalist editions. And when you go to the Fizcarraldo website, it's pretty similar. It's not covered in publicity quotes and blurbs. But when you go to the American one, you get a more conventional list of all the things critics have said about it. And I found reading through that list of all these brilliant, pithy things that clever people have written about it, that was really good. And I pulled out a few of them. But what struck me slightly was I almost had needed those prompts. I think when I finished this book, although I recognised I'd read something I thought was good, the writing is so fine, there are so many things in it that are really beautifully done, but I just wasn't quite sure what to make of it. And I'm curious to know, did you find in discussion it revealed itself more, or was your experience different to mine? I'm looking at Phil really because Phil was in the group.
Yeah. I would say with the book group, I think a lot of the people were initially, Laura can correct me on this, a bit dismissive of it and did not enjoy it much and weren't particularly blown away by the reveal on the afterward or the reveal in the plot point at the end of the book. But I think the more we discussed it, and I certainly was defending it, Frances had just read The Magic Mountain back to back with this. And I do think mulling over where she's commenting, where she's not, what she's doing with here. For me, it felt very similar to, I mean, not quite as essential and similar as like James on Huckleberry Finn, but it's much richer when you have books like this that are almost written as responses to have the initial source material in your head.
And Sarah, you didn't have anyone to discuss it with. You've got us now.
Yeah.
But when you finished it, what was your...
I definitely read some of the passages to Rob aloud, the philosophy passages. They kind of reminded me of the, oh crud, what's the cave book that you guys didn't like that I liked?
Oh, the Rachel Krishna.
Yeah.
Creation Lake.
Cave book.
It reminded me of Creation Lake and the way that they go off on all these ideas.
Ugh.
But I definitely, when I read the end, was like, oh my God, and like read it to Rob and was like, this is what she's doing. And then I also thought about, I don't know, I was quite excited by it. I thought about the symbolism of civilization as man and earth as Gaia and the way that the mounds and the sex with the earth. It worked on a lot of levels. Even though I didn't like it as much as Drive Your Plow. Drive Your Plow was one of my top books of the last few years. And this was very good. So yeah, I did like it. I was excited about it.
I was thinking, because I know, just from knowing you, and I know many of the books that I know you've loved, I know you're someone who's very connected to nature and you love things that explore the outdoors. And I thought the writing about these forests and these mountains, and also the sense, these are ancient mountains, the Silesian mountains, they're older than the Alps. And there's something about that sense of the earth as a living, sentient presence and nature that I thought you would probably like, and I quite enjoyed as well. And that, I think, is very much in Drive Your Plow as well, isn't it? She's very, very good at writing about the natural world in this way that really captivates you.
I feel like writing about the natural world right now is a bit zeitgeisty. And unfortunately, a lot of people hear that they're supposed to do that and try to do it. But she legitimately spends time outside. You feel that and you can tell that. And she's a big environmentalist from her writing. So I liked, I guess, the punishing element. It kind of comes back and consumes people. Are we going to talk about that part of it towards the end?
I mean, again, I'll have to do be like a David Foster Wallace. There'll be footnotes to the footnotes. I'll have to keep adding bits to the end.
Well, we don't, but it's sort of, I mean, but if you think of the book as like sort of a call and response, you know?
Yeah.
That's the response.
Yeah.
And I mean, is it too spoilery to say it goes a bit Shirley Jackson? Maybe if I don't say which thing I'm thinking of at the end. And I think there's something interesting in that as well, that then casts everything that you've read in a slightly different light, because it becomes, what will we willingly overlook? At what price does the many's ability to continue existing? At what cost does that come? And I think that feels like a constant, present, very urgent thought in contemporary life today, and especially rich Western countries. But it's this thing that is moral compromise that we're making all the time with the things that we choose not to look at or the things we choose not to engage with, that I am very conscious of and often very troubled by. And I liked the way that I felt like this book addressed that in a way that felt very meaningful.
Yeah.
I just thought, when I finished it, I was slightly bewildered, but also I thought, oh, that's a really clever book. Now, having this input of different people pointing out things to me, I'm increasingly dazzled by it, because when you read it, you don't think about all this clever stuff going on, but actually it's all in there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I would also say the previous Tokarczuk I'd read before this was Books of Jacob, which was the one she'd written before this, which is 3 times the length. I don't know. It's like Magic Mountain type long. And
it defeated me.
That one just completely went over my head. There was lots of it I enjoyed, but I just like, what was it about? I mean, it's sort of amazing, and I'm waiting for some point when someone puts out an annotated version of that with character lists and maps so I could just comprehend it. But this one, therefore, felt so much more enjoyable because I could grasp it and I could think about it and I could digest it in a way that the books of Jacob just seemed like it was written for a much smarter person.
I love, she does have this playfulness, doesn't she? You just reminded me there is a cast of characters at the beginning of this, which you don't actually need so much once you get into it. But at the
There's not a
beginning,
lot of
it's quite
characters in this
useful.
one. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but I found I did get a bit mixed up with who was who, especially with all these guest house residents.
Yeah.
Anyway, she does give you a useful little list. And then it goes on to the side characters. Glyceria, who was Voynich's almost like surrogate mother, the servant, when he was very young. I loved the way, by the way, that relationship was written about. That was really beautiful and poignant. That he goes down in sort of decreasing order of importance. Frau Large Hat, Tomask, Saint Emerentia, the Tunchi, charcoal burners, and she finishes with nameless inhabitants of the walls, floors, and ceilings. And the only other thing I love that we haven't really talked about is the Schrammerei, this liqueur that they're all constantly drinking, which is like laced with opium or something, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or it's made of mushrooms. So, again, there is this really legitimate basis, I think, for all these wild conversations and thoughts that they're all having, is that they're all addicted to this liqueur and swigging it at every opportunity.
And you have some? What do you have?
No, I was joking.
Ah.
We'd have to go out to the beach woods and harvest mushrooms and make our own, Sarah.
I mean, and I
please.
believe that there's a way you can get it in London. I think you can get everything in London.
I need to get my friend Christopher from So Many Damn Books to make us a cocktail.
Yeah.
So what do we think? Good book club book?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a lot to digest and go through, and I think it also will have divisive opinions.
Yeah, I think it feels like it comes into its own when you sit down to discuss it. You can enjoy reading it, but
I hate to say, but I would really like someone to make a film or really good miniseries out of it. I think it could be quite cinematic. I don't think that's her intention or anything, but I do think it would play, like you said, it played better sometimes listening to the conversations. I think seeing them have those conversations and the nature, and I think it would really work.
Agreed.
our follow-on recommendations coming up, and Laura's dialing in to give us her take on the book. But first, if you want more from the Book Club Review, you would be very welcome to join the pod's Patreon community. You'll get a weekly-ish minisode made just for subscribers to fill those gaps between the main shows. It might be Laura and me catching up over a recent read, like Good Material by Dolly Alderton. Or you can listen to us enthuse about Beth Brower's wonderful Emma M. Lyon series, our favourite recent discovery. My latest special episode is themed around the joy of long reads and features 11 recommendations to try. Our chat group is busy with recommendations as we swap notes on our current reads. And at the higher tier, you can join me live for the podcast book club, currently reading All the Beauty in the World, Patrick Bringley's memoir about leaving his job as a journalist after the death of his brother, leading to 10 years working as a museum guard at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. In March, we're reading Hateship, Friendship, Courtship, Loveship, Marriage by Alice Munro, and we'll shortly be voting on the titles for April, May and June, so come and help us decide. We meet on the last Sunday of the month over Zoom, with a catch-up episode posted for any book clubbers who couldn't make the live session. All that plus a read-along of War and Peace for all members, which has been a joy, and I'm currently wondering what long classic we might tackle next. Join us and have a say. Head to patreon.com/The Book Club Review for all the details, link in the show notes. You can also subscribe via Substack and find out more at substack.com/The Book Club Review. Alright, if you love the Empusium and crave more books set in creepy mountain health resorts, what would we recommend? Phil.
I'm just going to stick with the sanatorium theme. I have two very brief ones. One is a short story called The Sanatorium by Somerset Maugham, which is actually set in a Scottish sanatorium. It is a short story. You can read it in 40 minutes probably. You can also find it online because it was written long enough ago that you can find free versions. It uses his character Ashenden, who I've not read tons of Maugham, but Ashenden was a spy. He wrote various interconnected short stories about Ashenden. Ashenden then, 10 years later, who's sick for something and spends a while at the sanatorium in Scotland. And then it turns into this portrait of the sanatorium, much closer to the Swiss sanatorium of the Magic Mountain than the spooky sanatorium of Tokarczuk. And it ultimately turns into this very sweet, sort of love story about this husband and wife, which is very nice. And the other one I would recommend is the Miyazaki movie, The Wind Rises. It's not a book,
Oh.
but there's this glorious part that's about this real life historic 20th century figure who was involved in Japanese aviation. But there's this amazing part where he goes to the sanatorium in Japan. And also Thomas Mann and the Magic Mountain is referenced throughout the movie. And there's a Hans Castorp character. So it's all very direct references to Mann. If you like the vibe of a sanatorium and you want to see Miyazaki draw one, it is very good.
Huh, I didn't know that. I will definitely check that out. Sarah, how about you?
I don't have anything as good as those. I just want to do that. I want to do both of those. Those are great.
I found myself slightly at a loss, but I mean, the obvious one, I think, I would say, do read The Magic Mountain if you've been considering it and you're up for tackling a long book, but an absolute classic. And there's a reason. It's really good. It is long and you do have to it will challenge you. But I think without question, I would say it is totally worth it. And at the end, when you finish, it takes your breath away, what you've read and what you've experienced. And you kind of have to go through all of that in order to get the ending. But then when you get the ending, that book will become part of you in the way that all the best books do. So I do think it's worth it. And oh, hey, we've got a whole episode on it. Episode 157, I think it is. I referred to it recently. So you can go and listen to that. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Sarah. I have loved discussing this with you. Nothing more perfect than reading a great book and then getting to talk about it with two amazing people. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, Kate, I'm so sorry that I missed that conversation. That was fun. I laughed out loud at times.
Always love a chat with Phil and Sarah. And how are you feeling? Are your lungs okay?
Yes, my lungs are absolutely fine. Thank you. Although I did do a fair amount of subsequent research into tuberculosis.
Enough to get you worried?
Oh, no, not enough to get, well, not now, thanks to antibiotics.
I still don't understand. I've read so many Victorian novels where people just died awfully of TB. Lovely Ralph in Portrait of a Lady. Read that at a significant age and was devastated. But now is it just something where they give you antibiotics and it just goes away? Or you can't get it anymore?
I think a bit of both.
I just don't quite understand.
I think a bit of both.
How it could have gone from something that was so terrible to now something that's just like we don't even think about.
Antibiotics, because antibiotics cures it. It kills the bacteria in your lungs. And I don't think it's around very much anymore because when it does crop up, it can be cured. I think more in impoverished or war-torn or developing nations it can have flare-ups. I should add, listeners, we don't know. I mean, don't trust us. Feel free to email and be like, that is all lies.
Some kind of cross-section between our listenership and people with any form of medical training. They're probably howling right now.
We're not trying to spread misinformation. We are just ignorant.
We have grown up under the blanket of vaccination and can make these naive assumptions about it. So you've had a chance to listen back to the chat. Do your recollections of the book club discussion agree with Phil's? Are you broadly on the same page?
Well, we did have a good discussion. I think broadly speaking, people were underwhelmed. They found it quite tedious at times, which I don't think you guys actually disagreed with. It was more just that the tedium was part of the story, perhaps. Alice Chicken wasn't able to join us. She sent through a message beforehand, though, saying, I won't be able to make this one. If I had, I'd be talking about how much I disliked this book and feel like its subtitle was false advertising.
The horror story.
Phil makes a good case, though. I was like, oh, yes, okay, all right.
And the more you think about it,
the more horrifying it is. I don't know. I still think, I'm in line with Sarah here, I still think Tokarczuk could have made it scarier. Like, I would have enjoyed that, as well as the horror of this misogyny. She dialed up the fear factor.
Yeah, I agree. I felt the same. It would have been fun, wouldn't it? What was your feeling about the book then? Did you enjoy it?
It's a very good book. But is it as good as Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead? I said that slowly because I always get it wrong. No, it's not. That's such a successful novel in terms of how it comes together. And she really leans into the genre, which is another point that Sarah made. And I think that book surprised me hugely because I'd never read Tokarczuk. I think the thing with Empusium is it's somewhat tonally similar. And so the surprise of where she takes the novel isn't there as much. You expect it because you've read Drive Your Bones Over the... See, I can't say it. Drive Your Plow. I don't think you can criticize it, but it didn't massively move me or change how I thought about things. I should say My recollection here is a bit foggy, but I don't think I read the afterword. I think this was a key flaw in having that aha moment that everyone else did.
Yes, it recasts everything you've read. And when you get to it and you read it, it sharpens suddenly all of the stuff that you've been vaguely irritated by, because it's also annoying, all these pronouncements about how terrible women are with their inability to think seriously and their wandering wombs. You know, finally, it makes sense. You think, oh, I see what she's playing with here, and it's very, very clever. I almost thought when I finished it, I just admired it as an intellectual exercise, and I had this sense of this writer who is she's at the height of her powers, it feels. What can't she do? Her writing is so brilliant and her intellect is so dazzling. This felt like a playful intellectual exercise. And that's fine, but when you read it, it doesn't quite touch your heart in the way that I always hope that books will. But that said, what a fine piece of writing.
I think that's a perfect summary. You can't fault it. You're in good hands. It's perfectly crafted.
Mm. And how about follow-on reads? What would you recommend to people who like this and wanted something else?
Well, I'm not going to read Books of Jacob, which Phil said is for smarter people than him. I was like, who's a more intellectual reader than Phil? I don't think that exists.
Did you hear? At one point, he coined a genre. I only caught it when I was editing the episode. He called it Sanfic, which I love. Sanatorium fiction.
Well, I'm not going to recommend that crime novel I had you read called The Sanatorium, which came out a few years back.
Nope. I wasn't going to recommend that either. Although it is set in a sanatorium, and if you like crime thrillers, maybe you would enjoy it.
I mean, I did. It was a holiday read, listener.
Yeah.
Pretty grim. I mean, crime is, right? People die. I wouldn't recommend it, but gripping. No, I'm actually going to cheat because this is not my recommendation. This is a recommendation from Kim at the Paper Hound. I'm holding it in my hand. And it is called The Extinction of Irena Ray, a novel by Jennifer Croft. Now, who is Jennifer Croft, you ask? Well, she is the English language translator of Olga Tokarczuk. And this is her first novel, following on from the successful translations she's done. So it's her own prose, it's her own story. It's kind of about Olga Tokarczuk. So let me just read a little bit of the flap. From the International Booker Prize winning translator, a propulsive, beguiling debut about 8 translators and their search for a world-renowned Polish author who goes missing. 8 translators arrive at a house in the primeval Polish forest on the border of Belarus. It belongs to the writer Irena Ray, and they are there to translate her magnum opus, Grey Eminence. But within days of their arrival, Irena disappears without a trace. And then it goes on. And Irena Ray is very much a stand-in, Kim says, for Olga Tokarczuk. And there's also quite a lot of hallucinogenic drinking or eating, not sure which. That has parallels then with the Empusium.
A theme. I'm looking because I think she's translated by 2 people, isn't she? She's translated by Jennifer Croft and also Antonia Lloyd-Jones, who translated the Empusium and I think Drive Your Plough. Yeah, which is interesting. And Jennifer Croft did, heroically, the Books of Jacob and Flights.
Neither of which I have read.
Yes. Interesting. I haven't read enough to know if there's any difference in nuance when you're reading those 2
we should ask Phil.
translations.
I wonder if he's clocked it.
I was going to recommend, I've had time since that chat with Phil and Sarah to do a little bit more reading. Any form of cursory sanatorium literature Googling will bring you up with the Backlisted podcast episode they did on Betty Macdonald's book, The Plague and I. This is set in an American sanatorium, and she fell ill with what turned out to be tuberculosis. And she was sent off to this place called the Pines, where she was expected to stay for a year. So she's suddenly taken away from her very cozy family life, which she writes about with great warmth and charm. And she goes from that to this place, which is run more along the lines of the psychiatric institution when One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It's sort of military discipline and cold baths, and they are literally made to lie in beds most of the time. They're not allowed to move. And the worst thing, this is the true horror of this story, is that the women are not allowed to read. The men are given newspapers, but the women are not allowed to read, or certainly not at first, because this is felt to be
too much
exertion for their minds. She wrote it in 1948. I have been very happily working my way through it because her writing is a delight, very funny, surprisingly irreverent, warm. She's one of those people who sees humour and can make the best out of some actually really quite terrible situations. She was very good at that. I've really been enjoying that, but it is a bit of a curiosity. I don't think it's that easy to get hold of. I managed to get a copy through the London Library, but apart from that, I think it's quite expensive. But anyway, I do recommend it. And you should definitely, if you're interested in this kind of thing, check out that episode, because they do a lovely classic Backlisted style, very comprehensive deep dive into Betty Macdonald and her world. And I really, really enjoyed it. So I recommend that. The only other thing I kept thinking about was have you ever read The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman?
I don't think so, though I have read her book.
That is an absolutely brilliant novella. It's very creepy, and it has something of the same almost like haunting quality, and yet at the same time it's quite funny, weirdly. It's got the same sense of the horror of the situation that the woman finds herself in. She's been basically confined by her husband to this room at the top of the house where he feels she shouldn't be out. She's too easily disturbed mentally, and she needs to be kept in this room and very quiet and to rest. And it seems like he's being solicitous, but in fact, very quickly you realise that she's being effectively confined against her will. And this gradually starts to dawn on her too. But meanwhile, something is going on with the wallpaper. It's very good. It has that slight atmosphere of creeping dread, and also that brilliant slow reveal where gradually you start to really understand what's happening. Something of that I felt had echoes with the Tokarczuk that I really liked. So I recommend that. It's not long. It's one of those things you can sit down and read in one go, and it's absolutely brilliant. I recommend it highly.
That does ring bells. Perhaps I have read it. It sounds really good.
The other thing about it is that it's a feminist cri de coeur. It's about someone who is the embodiment of the oppression of women in the way that this culture around men and doctors acting with women's best interests in heart. But because of this supposed mental fragility, women were shut away, they were sent to institutions, they were sent to asylums, and it was a horrible form of misogynistic oppression. And so it absolutely feels very much in Tokarczuk's wheelhouse.
Thank you so much for looping me in to the episode and to the conversation. I will definitely try to join the next one with those guys.
Pleasure. Always so great talking with you. That's nearly it for this episode, which was produced and edited by me, Kate Slotover. Whether you listen at time of publication or at some distant point in the future, if you have thoughts, Laura and I would love to hear them. Comment anytime on the episode page on our website, thebookclubreview.co.uk, linked in the show notes. Comments there go straight to our inboxes, so drop us a line. We always love to hear from you. Don't forget you can subscribe to the show via Patreon or Substack, links in the show notes to find out everything that's on offer, including weekly minisodes, and on Patreon there's the opportunity to join the podcast book club and come and talk books with me in person. You'll also have the warm glow that comes from supporting me in making the show. I would love to see you there. Otherwise, come and find me on Instagram or Threads at Book Club Review Podcast. Next up, I'm discovering the secrets to happiness through reading with author and podcaster Daisy Buchanan. Until then, thanks for listening and happy book clubbing. So yeah, you finish the book, you do get a little epilogue, and then a glossary of how the names have changed to the present day, and you think, okay, fine. And then you get to this author's note and you're dutifully reading the last bit. You've read this far, you might as well read on. And it says, all the misogynistic views on the topic of women and their place in the world are paraphrased from texts by the following authors: Augustine of Hippo, Bernard of Cluny, William S. Burroughs, Cato, Joseph Conrad, Charles Darwin, Emile Durkheim, Henry Fielding, Sigmund Freud, H. Rider Haggard, Hesiod, Jack Kerouac, D. H. Lawrence, Cesare Lombroso, W. Somerset Maugham, John Milton, Friedrich Nietzsche, Ovid, Plato, Ezra Pound, Jean Racine, François de la Rochefoucauld, Jean-Paul Sartre, Arthur Schopenhauer, Simonides of Amorgos, William Shakespeare, August Strindberg, Jonathan Swift, Algernon Charles Swinburne, Tertullian, Thomas Aquinas, Richard Wagner, John Webster, Frank Wiedekind, Otto Weininger, and William Butler Yeats. The fact that there's enough of them that she has to put them in alphabetical order.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And they're everyone on your reading list, everyone you had to do for whatever you guys had in America, different tests, but A levels, that's your A level. If you know all those guys, you're going to ace British thought.
So what is the horror here? Yeah, it's not what you're expecting. It's actually a different kind of horror. The horror is this canon of men that pronounce on the world and whose works we read and whose ideas have greatly informed society and culture as we know it today. their views on women, as echoed throughout this book, are horrifying. That is the horror.